So Alan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, my friend.
I'm really, really looking forward to this. I think we've been trying to get something in the diary for a little while, and we've finally been able to do it. So for those of you that are listening, obviously you've just heard that Alan has got quite the experience in terms of CV and what he's done and where he's been, and he's just truly is an incredible human being. In fact, I remember the very first time that I saw you at an event years ago now, and I just literally to try and describe this to those of you that are listening right now is that sometimes you see people in a crowd of people and you just know there's something special about them. You don't know what it is. You don't know, you just can't put your finger. It's like an energy, it's an aura, and you absolutely had that. And then when I saw you speak, I was just blown away. It's almost just like there's something radiating out of you, which I having got to know you over the last few years now, I believe that to just be love. You know, you're just like pure love. It's just in abundance and wanting to share with people. And I don't think I've ever told you that, but that's
no, thanks, Will. Man, that's I'm moved, man. Thank you so much. It's beautiful to hear, man. It's lovely to hear because love is something that I've has always been important to me my whole life, and I only found out how to really feel real love, from the inside out in recent years, and that's something that I try and help people to discover for themselves. So I'm it's very kind of you to say that. Thank you, my friend.
No, my pleasure. And in terms of you and like I said, the first context I ever saw you was operating as a peak performance coach and as an incredible speaker. I mean, you truly are. And this isn't just me saying this, many people regard you as one of the most dynamic speakers in the world. You know, this isn't just you speak at a few events. People regard you as one of the most dynamic speakers in the world. And I know you're an incredibly humble guy, but in terms of getting to that point and doing the work you do of empowering thousands of people from all over the world, which you speak to in any typical year, obviously 2020 is not a very typical year as we know, but to get to that point, like most people, there's a bit of a story to it. So I'd love to know how you and to share with the listeners how you got to that point.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I appreciate it again and again. I appreciate those accolades, my man. And when I hear people say that, I do think, wow, it's obviously it's cool to be described as that, and at the same time, I think, wow, is that even true? Right? Is that even real? When you hear something like that, so it is lovely to hear that. Thank you, man. I think when you were saying that, I was actually just thinking, the memory is triggered, when people speak, and my memory was triggered then. I had lots of little images flashing through my mind about different stages that I've stood on and who I've spoken with, and just what people have said after I've spoken. And I think it just comes down to enthusiasm. I'm very enthusiastic. I've always been enthusiastic. But through the studies that I've done and through the work I've done, I've also then become very passionate about my subject. And, I am very passionate about people. I'm very passionate about, how people can show up in a different way in their own lives, and they can feel more of what's important to them rather than being distracted by what people have told them is important to them or what should be important to them, So that all combines in just, and then I want to share that with people. So I've had that opportunity to do that all around the world. Like you say, this has been a very different year. Usually I'm always traveling and speaking on different stages. And this year has also been beneficial in that I've been able to reach more people through the benefit of Zoom and webinar and, technology. Through the last 5-6 months, I've been speaking to people all around the world, and I've reached more people actually online than I would have reached had I been traveling. So there's always blessings to every experience, isn't there? Every challenge brings its own gift. And now we're speaking here, you and I, and I'm looking forward to this. We've been talking about this for a while. So I'll be looking forward to answering any questions you have. And it has been an interesting journey for sure, definitely. I'm ready to rock and roll, my friend.
So let's go right back to the beginning of the journey. So your personal development journey, how did that start for you?
I think like anyone, it starts, very shortly after you're born, although we don't realize that until much later. And some of us never realize that. So even though the vast majority of people will never be introduced to personal development per se, we are always constantly being challenged in our life day in, day out, and to develop, and that's what life is. Life is a series of challenges that causes us to either step up, step through, or to be held back by whatever we're facing. And even if that's just our own thinking. But really, my personal development journey really started when I was introduced to the subject of personal development, was when I was 21. And somebody encouraged me to read Think and Grow Rich. I was 21 years of age. I was at a stage in my life when, I would say that I was suffering with post-traumatic stress. I was had severe emotional mood swings at that time. I was that was exacerbated by the fact that I was drinking every single day, drinking myself virtually into a coma. I was also, taking drugs on top of that. I was very angry. I'd just been 7 months out of the military, and a friend of mine who was seeking to help me, who could see what I was going through. He was the one who introduced me to the book Think and Grow Rich, and he said, "Listen, read this book. It'll help you. It'll help you to understand what's going on inside your own mind, and also more importantly, it's going to inspire you to begin to create a different future for yourself. Because right now, where you are, the future probably seems very bleak, if you even have a future in your own mind." And he was very right. And because he was so perceptive, it really made me sit up and listen. And also I respected him. He was a very good friend of mine. He was one of my best mates. And he also exuded the kind of enthusiasm that inspired me. When I saw him, and I wanted some of that. He was very confident. He was very emotionally mature for his age, 21 years of age. He had been in the same operation as me. We were both in Angola. He was doing a very different role to what I was. And so when he said to me, "Read this book and pay attention, read it like the author's, talking to you, read it with that kind of attention. Imagine the author's actually sitting down with you." And I've always read a book like that, actually. It was the best advice I've ever heard, really. He said, "Read this book like the author's sitting across the table from you, and he's giving you personal notes from his life. And he's an exceptionally successful man. That's how you want to read it." And so I made notes, paid attention, and that book really just opened me up. Within the first few pages, I was like, "Wow, this is amazing. How come we don't learn this at school? And how come they don't teach us this when we're young? I wish I'd come across this when I was very young." And wow, got a little ant crawling on my phone. Isn't that cool? I wonder where he came from. He must have crawled all the way up this tripod. And so, it was just really great advice, and so that book really just set me on a new path. I became a student that day for the first time in my life. I wasn't academically minded, although I went to 2 private schools, very expensive, both of them. And, my parents wanted me to have a good education, which I didn't really, I didn't value at the time. I was rebellious as a kid. I was seeking approval, seeking attention, seeking validation. And I did that in a rebellious fashion. I was an only child. I went to these 2 very expensive private schools, and I really just wasted my education. Wasn't academically minded. However, at 21 years of age, when I began to read Think and Grow Rich, I became a student for the first time. And that was 32 years ago now. And 1988. What are we in? 2020 now. 32 years ago. And that opened a brand new journey for me, and I thought, wow. And I began to read. And initially I read because I was reading with the motivation that I always felt like a broken kid. I always felt like an outsider. I suffered from the four most limiting paradigms that I talk about on stage. You don't feel like you're enough. You don't feel lovable. You certainly don't feel like you fit in. And that was definitely me. And then the 4th one was, it's not available to me. So I used to look around and say, "That's not available to me. That's not available to me. That's not available to me." And there's so many people who walk around with that one, where they look at other people and they think what they have is not available to me. They're not even aware of it, whether that's love, success, whatever it is. I suffered from all 4 of those. And very soon, early on in that journey, I began to read about, the effects of trauma on the nervous system, conditioning, programming, how the mind, how behavior is formed, all that kind of stuff. And it fascinated me. I was really fascinated by the subject. And the more I read, the more I wanted to read, And as I said, it was initially just so that I thought I was broken and I wanted to fix myself. Then I began to realize that everybody's suffering from the same kinds of stuff. Everybody's got this challenge of how their mind either will, the mind will either keep you trapped, or, you can set yourself free if you use your mind in a very different way. And one thing led to the next. And then, 32 years later, I've got this wealth of knowledge. And it always astounds me too, Will, when I stand on stage and I start speaking and I pull this stuff from what I've read, etc. And I seem to pull these quotes and these passages and refer to books, and I think, oh my gosh, and, it's just stuff that I've read over and over and over, over the period of the 32 years. And, it's brought me to the current moment where I've been able to work with amazing people, in that, if I look back at my journey, the people that I've worked with, very accomplished business people, very accomplished sports people, world champion sports people, world champion rugby players, military, police. I've spoken at universities, just spoke at Wolverhampton, at a college in Wolverhampton last Friday, to 240 students about the same subject, the mind. And and the most difficult game was ever played is between our ears. So it's been a great journey, you know, and it's I think where I came from and what I've come through, it's been very, very interesting. Yeah.
So I just want to touch on that because, again, I regard you as a dear friend. We've got to know each other really well over the last few years, which for me is an absolute privilege because it wasn't that long ago that I was looking up at you going, wow, that guy, you know, and so now to be able to call you my friend is a real privilege. And
well, it's a privilege we both share, my friend.
Thank you.
You've done amazing things too, my friend. And, it's always good to see people grow. And I see what you've done with, you know, making such a difference to so many people, serving so many people with your, you know, the goals you've set for yourself, and the goals have always come from that place. I've recognized that in you as your goals to serve others. And I love that, you know.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. In terms of adversity, because I know one of the big things that you've gone through is you've gone through a fair bit of adversity. You touched on your military experience and you mentioned Angola because that, and you said about your PTSD, because that was I mean, you brushed over it, but that was a real traumatic period of your life, right?
Yeah. It was. Well, first of all, let me go back a bit. Is that you know, I grew up in a place in Durban, which is on the east coast of South Africa. And when people talk about South Africa, people who have visited South Africa, they've usually visited Cape Town or Johannesburg. Very few people have been to Durban. Durban's on the east coast. We've got amazing weather, beautiful beaches, great waves, good-looking people. But also, you know, in '66, you know, South Africa was a very different place. South Africa is still a very tough place to live. You know, it's a very, very tough place to live. And there's a small minority of people who have it well, who have a good life. The vast majority of people are struggling there. And right now, people are struggling worse than ever out there. You know, the people at the bottom end of the food chain are literally starving to death because they've lost their low-income wage. But in '66, I grew up next to a police station in one of the toughest neighborhoods in my city, in Durban, in a place called Point Road. And, you know, anybody in Durban will tell you about Point Road, especially in the '60s and the '70s. Very tough neighborhood. I grew up right next door to a police station. That was a very interesting education, the first 6 years of my life. Around the age of 4, I became curious about what was happening in the police yard next door. I'd climb on the wall and I'd look into the police yard through a little gap that nobody knew really existed. I couldn't see a lot, but I could see enough. It was an interesting education. So I would say I was already traumatized. You know, I've done a lot of work around trauma. Trauma plays a big role in my work that I do with adults now, because I think that we are all traumatized children walking around in big bodies. And unless we actually work through that trauma, you know, consciously and constructively, it will always get in the way of us being effective adults. And so I was already traumatized at that age. It made me feel unsafe. You know, I went kind of literally overnight feeling safe, living next door to a police station. Wow, I've got the police next door, right? It's fantastic. And as a kid, you look up at men in uniform. You know, I still remember those uniforms to this day. You know, the hats, the pressed t-shirt, the pressed shirts, and the slacks, and the brown leather holster on the right hip, the revolver, the leather strap from the bottom end of the revolver, you know, to the belt. You know, so you couldn't actually take a revolver off a person in those days. It was strapped to them. I remember, you know, everything, and then literally overnight watching what happened in the police yard one day at the age of 4 and thinking, wow, I feel unsafe. You know, I was feeling safe living here next door, but now I'm feeling completely unsafe from what I saw. And then through my youth, I was, you know, bullied a lot, teased a lot, went to, you know, school in South Africa in those days, all boys schools, only boys or what, initiation, hierarchy, you know, very, very obvious. And boarding school was traumatic, you know, traumatic for a lot of boys. What I used to tell myself is my skin's getting thicker. That's what I actually told myself consciously. I used to tell myself that consciously. I used to say it out loud. I would say it under my breath. I'd say, don't worry, Allan, your skin's getting thicker. You're developing rhinoceros skin. That's what I used to say to myself. I'm developing a rhinoceros skin. You know, the stuff is bouncing off me. But it really did hurt me. You know what I mean? You know, we say as kids, you know, sticks and stones can break your bones, but words will never hurt you. But actually, words do hurt. You know, they hurt children. The psyche is affected by stuff like that. So by the time I got into the military,
just quickly,
19.
Because you mentioned the schoolyard, and I've heard you say this before, but what you saw in the schoolyard, and you say you were so young, you were 4. You're cool to share what that you saw
in the police yard.
Yeah.
Well, I watched a policeman was beating a black man to death with a whip,
at 4 years old.
I didn't understand at the time that, you know, I probably didn't think at the time that he was being beaten to death. I just saw what I saw was just like, wow, you know. I watched, you know, he was beating a man with a sjambok, which is a it's called a sjambok, and it's made of natural materials, and it's made into a whip, and you can buy them, and they're very popular in South Africa, and they use them for cattle, they use them for all kinds of things. People use them as weapons of self-defense, but it's lethal in the wrong hands. It tapers down to a very thin edge, and it's at least 8 feet long, and in the wrong hands, it carves flesh like a hot knife through butter. And so I saw that, and it was insane. And then obviously when I got older, and I started hearing about what was happening in South Africa, and especially when I went to the military, and the propaganda we would hear, and etc., and the stuff that we would see, there was a lot of rioting in South Africa at that time. There's still rioting, but it's a different kind of rioting now. And you hear stories, and then you see people, what's happening on the news, and I was and the racism was obvious, and there was a lot of tension in that country. Still a lot of tension now. That tension is never really eased, and it's obvious, and so that affected me definitely. And I remember when I was at school, the first black boy that arrived at my school, and he was an outsider, obviously, spoke perfect English. His father was educated in Oxford, and he was an outsider, I was an outsider. We became friends, and I used to get beaten up because they used to call me this disgusting name, or this disgusting term. If you befriended black people, there was a term for that, which is ugly, and then you would be called that, and I was called that all the time, and then beaten up for the fact that I was one of those people that befriended black people, which is weird, right? In this day and age, if we think about that now, but then it was like completely weird. If you watch movies, about, America back in the day, if you watch movies about, segregation when it was completely rough and completely obvious and volatile, that's what it was like. And so I saw that side of South Africa, and I was exposed to it on a regular basis. And then by the time I got in the military, I was a kid who was already, very low self-esteem, very low self-belief, very self-conscious, no confidence whatsoever. And then in the military, what I did was I became very fit, and I wanted to join the Parabats. I never made it into the Parabats because apparently I didn't have the right psychology for it. Parabats is, you want to jump. I want to jump out of airplanes. They're considered the cream of the cream in South Africa, and I just liked the idea of being able to jump out of airplanes. But really, if I think about it, the truth was that I befriended these 5 guys, and we became really tight. And the 5 of us were together right from our very first moment when our first intake, and we were together through our basic training. And then we said, right, let's all go through Parabats together. So I thought, cool. We got split up, and 3 went one way, 2 went another way, and then I ended up, being called off into mechanized infantry, and I ended up being trained using a patrol mortar pipe and an RPG-7 rocket launcher, which is this weapon you see in movies a lot. That weapon put on the shoulder. It's got a sight, a trigger, and it fires a rocket-propelled grenade. It was fun using those weapons in mock operations, and we would have a lot of mock operations, and there would all be all these vehicles, these so-called enemy vehicles, and then we would practice these operations. And I would practice dropping these mortars, at certain distances, and shooting these rocket-propelled grenades into vehicles. I never thought I'd have to use that in real time. And then we ended up in Angola in '87, and there were, we were 5,000 troops from South Africa who were sent up there, sworn to secrecy, but the government had to sign a document, and we were told that we're going to war and that some of us wouldn't be coming home. So we had to look around and make sure that we, you valued your friendships. Because some of those guys wouldn't be coming home. That's what we had actually told. And then there was some prayers said, and then we jumped in these vehicles and we went up to Angola for 3 days in a mechanized infantry. Just kept driving. Eventually got into Angola, and we're driving around in 6-wheel tanks, 20mm cannon on top, and anti-air gun at the back. Designed to carry 10 troops, 5 on each side, 6-wheelers, massive, huge vehicles, and carry their own water tanks. Massive, you're talking about 18 tons, right? Fully armed. And then, we were in a combat zone, and then it was just like, we encountered the enemy for the first time 2 weeks after we arrived in Angola. We're driving through the bush in formation. That's what we did all day, every day. And then at nighttime, we would just camp, and there would be complete silence. And then occasionally you would hear the enemy in the night, moving vehicles, you know, in the distance. And then the next day we would break camp, and then we would get into formation. Then we'd just drive through the bush, 2 miles across, 2 miles deep, tanks, water vehicles. We had, you know, enemy jets dropping bombs on us, MiG-27s, Russian. All the artillery that we were fighting against was Russian. We were fighting against Russians and Cubans. And then there were 52,000, according to our reconnaissance, 52,000 enemy troops all camped in different size encampments all over Angola. And we were driving through thick bush. You know, there was no roads or anything. We had to drive through. Our tanks were making roads by just driving, you know, through trees and over trees, and it was insane. You know, I think about it now. It's just insane, actually. I'm just thinking about all these things going through my mind. You know, just suddenly, you know, there's 3 MiG jets that just, you know, looking for us. So we have to, you know, pull under the trees and throw out the camo netting and just sit still, you know, for 20 minutes while these jets are looking for us. And then the jets disappear, and then, you know, we roll up the camo, and then we're moving through the bush again, you know, and then we encounter the enemy every other day. You know, we encounter the enemy, have these skirmishes, you know, these full-on battles, you know, which last anywhere between, I don't know, half an hour or sometimes 2 hours, and just crazy. And all the time, all these memories now, all that time, 24 hours a day for 7 months that I was there, we had these G5s and these G6s. Now, that was known at the time. I don't know if it still is the case, but at the time it was the best field cannon ever built by South Africa, G5 and G6. And these had 40-kilometer pinpoint accuracy, 40 kilometers, right? So these field cannons, and these are massive field cannons, right? And these shells are huge shells, right? I'm talking like massive shells. And these cannons were like, you know, 40 clicks back. And these things would just be pumping 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just like, boof. You can just hear in the distance, boof, boof. And they were just, you know, shelling the enemy, you know. It was crazy, man. Just crazy.
So those times, I'm sure, added to the trauma, because obviously, yes, that's real. Like you said, it's not just mock up. You're not just training. This is real life. You're in warfare.
Yeah.
There's fatalities and yeah.
I mean, close combat too. A lot of the time.
Close combat, yeah.
Yeah, close. I mean, we were like guys in trees, you know. I remember the very first combat we went into. You know, there were foxholes, guys in trees. You know, we literally had to jump out. I jumped out with my weapons ready to set up, etc. And then we were told to pull back because we ran into these 4 Russian tanks, and we were outgunned, and they took us out very quickly. Took out one of our cars, and very, you know, within the next 5 minutes, I was giving someone a blood transfusion, and it was actually a friend of mine. He was an anti-air gunner. Who's one of. I'm pointing to my right because we had 3 cars in front of us, and I was in the HQ car. I was with a lieutenant. Because I was a mortarist. And so these Alpha Bravo Charlie, they carry 10 troops each, plus the anti-air gunner, the gunner, the driver, and the corporal in each of those cars. And then the lieutenant is, that's your formation, 3 cars, 1 behind. But you got 2 miles of that, 2 miles across and spread out, you know, and then 2 miles deep, so upside down U. And in the middle, then you've got operations, you know, like, you know, the generals and the majors, etc., etc. And we were on the right flank, and our logistics were off, and we were too far to the left, and we ran into these 4 Russian tanks unexpectedly. That was over in 2.5 minutes, but in that 2.5 minutes, we lost 12 guys, you know, and 13 guys, yeah. And one of those guys, well, another guy who bled out afterwards, but while I was giving him some blood, you know, he was in the Charlie car who took a bit of shrapnel through the front of his head. Lost the back of his head, and he bled out. He didn't make it. But yeah, that was my very first encounter, my very first combat. And then it was like 7 months of that every other day, you know, just running into these different groups, you know, of enemy. And these guys would be in the trees and foxholes, you know, dug underground and bunkers, tanks, the Russian tanks, and they were using T-55s. They would be, you know, just crazy. They would be dug in the ground with just a turret above the ground, so you couldn't see it until you're right on top of it. It was nuts, man. It was,
so that whole experience, I mean, a crazy experience from when you were 4 in the police station to then at school to then this. I mean, it's fair to say, even at 21 years old, because that's how old you were when you come out of the military, right?
I turned 21 years. I turned 21 14 days after I came home. I came home on the 12th of December. I remember, 12th of December, I got home. And on the 26th of December, I turned 21, and it was very It was a very muted Christmas, you know.
Yeah.
I don't remember. I didn't talk much.
And that whole experience that's within your first 2 decades of being alive is obviously giving you so much of a foundation for you to then go and learn about yourself. So then obviously you mentioned that the PTSD, and there are people right now that are arguably suffering that will be listening to this.
Absolutely.
For you, Think and Grow Rich was the book that opened everything else. And like you say, it's where you first truly become a student. And then you read the book, and then what happened? Because I know that's not the only adversity you had, right? I mean, you obviously then went on your journey, and I'd love to know about that.
Yeah. And it could have been any book, you know. I mean, that was the first book I read, but it was the first book in a whole lot. I mean, the second book I read was You Can Heal a Life by Louise Hay. Then I read Mind Power by John Kehoe. And then I started reading, you know, then I was listening to cassette tapes, Brian Tracy, Jim Rohn, Dennis Waitley, Les Brown. You know, I got into sales very early on. So Tom Hopkins was a firm favorite of mine. But I was more interested in the psychology. I started reading about child psychology. I started reading about trauma. And then, you know, I became fascinated by that subject. Yeah, for sure. And like you say, there's a lot of people right now are challenged. But then the first 20 years of my life you know, if I think about it, I can remember certain happy moments, but for the most time I was unhappy and very introverted and very self-conscious. And then, you know, once I found personal development, I started to learn about confidence, and I started, you know, reading about this stuff and started practicing this stuff. At the same time, I wasn't really happy because I started using drugs at the age of 20. I was already smoking marijuana at 14 while I was in boarding school, and then continued smoking marijuana right through the military. There's a lot of marijuana in the military, and then you know, I continued doing that, and then I started taking acid, and that was really, you know, I had some really, really bad trips where I was reliving my military experience, like in like, you know, full on 3D, although it was all, you know, what's the word? Hallucinations. And so then I stopped doing that because it really, you know, I was having these really bad trips. And so I moved away from that. But at the same time, what I was trying to do, I was just, you know, this is the best way to explain it. And it's the same way I say the same thing to anyone that I'm working with. And I've worked with the military and the police. You know, when you've had that kind of experience, wherever you are feels uncomfortable. You know, you're always trying to get away from, you think you're trying to get away from a particular, you know, experience, event, person, environment, whatever it is. But wherever you go, the same feeling is there where you are. So you really, without realizing it until you become conscious, you're actually trying to get away from what you're feeling inside. You're trying to get away from who you are, from what you've experienced, from all this unconscious trauma. You can't get away from that. You have to process that. And it took me a long time to discover that. And through the reading I did. And then, like you say, you know, I moved to London, and I got involved in the nightlife, and started using a lot of drugs. And I was trying to just numb the feeling I was feeling inside. I was trying to get away from myself. I didn't really like who I was. I didn't like, my experience of life wasn't enjoyable, you know, and I looked for ways to, you know, to distract myself, you know, and that's what I did very successfully. I distracted myself. I didn't realize I was doing that at the time because I was enjoying myself, and I was, you know, lost in the decadent lifestyle of London, the nightlife. And I went through just, you know, a whole bunch of different jobs, etc. And I did a lot of sales jobs. But all the time I was reading and studying, and then I got involved in landmark education, and I went through the landmark curriculum. Started with the forum, just like everyone does, and then the advanced course, and the self-expression leadership program, did the communication programs. I got into I was being trained to be the forum leader for South Africa. I went back to South Africa, and I did some introductions for the landmark there. Helped to establish landmark in South Africa in 1998. In October of 98, we did the very first landmark forum in Cape Town. And there were about 350 people there. It was fantastic to see that transformation unfolding. I was having a lot of transformation in my own life, obviously, but at the same time, I was still burning the candle at both ends, because I was addicted to drugs at that time, and I was very unhappy. And although I was reading and feeding on my mind, I still hadn't dealt with my own internal demons. And it wasn't until I got to UPW, which is Unleash the Power Within, like you know yourself, with Tony Robbins, who's a firm favorite for a lot of people. And I'd started. Actually, the very first book I bought when I arrived in London was Unlimited Power. That was 1990, March of 1990. I was in London. I was walking around. By this stage, I had been reading, you know, like a, just reading, absorbing information from July of 1988 when I read Think and Grow Rich, and now it's March of 1919. I've read so many books, and I arrive in London. The first book I buy is Unlimited Power. It's my introduction to NLP for the very first time. NLP, I'm thinking, wow, neuro-linguistic programming, that sounds fascinating. Let me buy this book. And that was a very good introduction. Brilliant book, Unlimited Power, still a brilliant book. And, Tony wrote that book at around the age of 26, and it's an amazing book. Still good to this day. And then that introduced me to NLP. Then I got involved with Landmark, as I said. And then it wasn't until I actually went to Unleash the Power Within in 1999, first time myself as a student. And that also was a case of synchronicity, I guess, because I got to a point in 1999 where I had this head full of knowledge. I'd read all these books, absorbed all these tape programs. By that stage, it was starting to move to CDs, listening to CDs, was going to workshops, and was working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day at Credit Suisse First Boston in the bank in Canary Wharf. To be honest, I was not enjoying life. I was hating life actually at that point. And I was frustrated because I had all the access to all this knowledge and nothing was changing. And all the, everything we read about personal development, change your life, do this, change your life, change your life. And nothing was changing for me. And then synchronistically, I opened a paper. There's an advert for Tony Robbins, Unleash the Power Within. And it was the right time for me. I thought, wow, this must be good timing. This is divine timing. This is a sign. I was at a really low point in my life. I was suicidal. I was thinking about jumping out of that train on a regular basis, and just hating the person I saw in the mirror, and hated my life really. And to make matters worse, I went through a major breakup and relationship, and that also just added to it, right? And I just felt really alone. And I just thought, well, what's the point of living, right? No one's going to miss me. And I think about that regularly, and I procrastinated that every day. I say, I'll do it tomorrow. And then I saw that advert, and then I went to that workshop in Cardiff, Wales. And on the third day, I had this amazing interaction with Tony, this one-on-one interaction in front of the whole audience. And that was the day I really just kind of, for the first time in public, I aired my demons, about the military. I just said, hey, listen, you know what? I've been carrying this thing for 13 years. I went to Angola and I killed these people, and it's haunting me, and I just realized that I haven't dealt with that. I just buried it, and I buried it under drugs and hedonistic lifestyle. And on top of that, to make it even more frustrating for me, as I had all this knowledge in my head and I wasn't using it. And that's why I always say to people, I always ask every audience, raise your hand if you think knowledge is power. And everyone puts their hand up. I say, no, that's BS. Knowledge is not power, because we acquire knowledge all the time and we don't do anything with it. And the vast majority of the human race has been told to acquire knowledge from school, college, university. And then also that same majority of the human race that has been to school, college, and university is still unhappy, traumatized, broke, alone, self-conscious, and suffering with all kinds of, challenges. And so knowledge is not power. And then, in that workshop, I just stood up and I said, look, I've been carrying this thing with me for so long, and I realized I need to just deal with it. And I can't, I just have to face it. And I first have to admit to it. And I guess that's what I love about the seminar environment, Will. And I think maybe you recognize this yourself, or you agree with me, is the seminar environment. There's a lot of people who have never been to a seminar, and people who knock the seminar around and say, wow, a bunch of seminars. Who wants to go to a seminar, right? Crazy, sit in a room with a whole bunch of strangers and talk about your personal stuff. But it's very, very cathartic and very therapeutic when you can admit something in public and recognize that you won't be vilified for it. Because I was afraid to say that to my whole life. I was afraid to say, when I first arrived in England, I was afraid to say I was from South Africa, because South Africans usually get a bad rap. South Africa wasn't very popular in the late 80s. In the early 90s, there was a lot of boycotts against South Africa because of apartheid and racism, etc. And then I didn't want to tell anyone I'd been to the military, because I certainly didn't want to tell anybody that I had, dropped mortars on all these people and, put these rockets into all these vehicles, NA vehicles carrying troops. But when I did that, when I said that, and I talk about this, unconditional love. Unconditional love is a very powerful thing. And unfortunately, nobody knows how, we don't learn about unconditional love. Most parents do not give their children unconditional love. Love is conditional. for the vast majority of the human race, it's conditional. That's why we suffer, because love is conditional, because we've never really been taught that love is something we can give ourselves, that love is something we must give ourselves, and love is something we must give unconditionally. And because of behavior and patterns of behavior, and because we are creatures of habit, what we learn to do is we learn to use love. We learn to use love in a very underhand, unhealthy way. As a club, as we learn to use emotional blackmail. And I was 32 years of age, and I'd never really ever felt love, from myself, from my parents. Listen, my parents loved me for sure. I got to see that. I got to see that much later. However, they didn't know how to demonstrate that love. So therefore, I felt unloved. And that's the vast majority of children, because most people do not know how to demonstrate love. They do not know how to give love, because they don't know how to be vulnerable. And so 32 years of age, I had a stranger, 6'7" stranger that I didn't know from a bar of soap, besides reading his books and listening to him on cassette tape. And he had traveled, in my mind, this man had traveled from America to stand in front of me in Cardiff, Wales for 4 days. And then we had this one-on-one interaction. And here was a man who was, a stranger to me. And yet he completely accepted what I said without any form of judgment. I just didn't feel zero judgment from him. And he loved me anyway. And I felt I felt unconditionally loved by a stranger, even though I just told him about all my, my darkest secrets, and the things that I was ashamed about. And yet he just said to me, he said, listen, everyone makes mistakes, and he loved me. I felt that love from him. And I thought, wow. And that was it was a major point for me. And it's very difficult. I hope when I explain it, I hope it comes across, but it's very difficult to explain what I felt. I felt like a release, a massive release, like the pressure was off, the cork had popped, It was like the way I describe it often is like a boil, it was like a boil that popped and all the pressure was released. And I thought, wow, okay, I've spoken about that. Now I've said that. I've been carrying that with me for so long, and I've been ashamed of that, hiding that, buried that. And now I've said it out in front of 1,500 people, and I'll deal with what comes next. And what came next was a lot of compassion. I had people like, the audience reaching out to me. You've been in that environment where you see people share something that they've been carrying with them, and you can see their face change in front of your eyes, and I've worked with thousands of people now, and I've been able to do the same thing, deep traumatic interventions. And you see people literally become 10 years younger in front of your eyes in the space of minutes, because they've been carrying something with them for so long, and it's eating them from the inside, like it was for me. And I just felt an immediate release. And then compassion. That's what the first thing I thought was, wow, people are giving me their compassion. And then maybe I can, begin to deal with this stuff openly. And then I started to begin to deal with it openly. I started talking about it whenever I could, because I realized that the more I spoke about it, the more I released, the more I healed it, the more I processed it. We have to process our trauma. If we don't process it openly with another human being, it's always important to process trauma with another human being, at least one or more. Because what you do is then you get compassion. That's the only way you can feel compassion. That's the only way you can feel vulnerability. You can't feel vulnerability unless you express yourself with another human being, at least one, even if it's only one. That's why therapy works to some degree, and then you have to have intervention. And then you also have to have action. You have to change direction. That's why there's so many different modalities when it comes to therapy. And, it's always going to be a major tool for helping people to transcend their limitations of their own mental constructs or their own human psyche. So that's why I'm I'm very, very big ambassador of the seminar environment, of workshops, of, self-study, self-development, self-inquiry, and also, public inquiry. Sitting in a room with people is a very, very powerful thing, because the group dynamic, what it does for people, and most people don't understand this, but the group dynamic is you're always going to get about 15% of people in the room, in any size room, are going to be actively engaged. And then you're going to get about 85% who are passively engaged. Those people who are passively engaged are absorbing what the 15% are sharing, and they're relating to it. They're saying, that's me too. That's me too. And when we watch someone else go through a major transformation in front of our eyes, we also go through the transformation indirectly, whether we realize it or not. It might be slightly slower, but also what it does then, it gives us the courage to actually face what we've been avoiding. And it gives us the courage to look at our own life in a different way. We say, wow, if they can get through that. And then also, without realizing it, people want to deal with their stuff. They want to heal. They want to transcend. They want to transform. They want to move. They want to grow. there's nothing worse than being stuck. And most people recognize this at an unconscious level, even if they're not aware of it. And so that's why I think personal development is such a powerful thing. And I've just given you a whole bunch of stuff now in the last 20 minutes, So yeah, and I have had, of course, I've had lots of challenges in my journey. And, I always tell people, I say, when you study yourself, when you get into personal development, when you read some books and you start to apply them in your own life, you start to apply the tools you learn. That doesn't mean you're going to become happy overnight. You're not going to become suddenly, enlightened. You're not going to suddenly become successful and happy. You have to work through your own stuff, and we've all got stuff to work through. And what that means is you will encounter challenges along the road, for sure. I mean, I've been through divorce. I broke my children's hearts. I broke their mother's heart, broke my parents' heart, broke her parents' heart. Because when you go through a divorce, all the family is affected. I've been in major financial challenges during that time too. But what I tell people is that it's the same thing. When you grow in an upwards direction. It's kind of like the stock market, right? Over the last 100 years, the stock market, it's been going up. Although there's been moments, if you focus in on moments, you'll see it went down. If you focus only on that moment, you might be in that moment thinking, oh my God, my life is going through the floor. But if you pull back and you look at the trajectory of your life from when you first started, it's in an upwards direction, even though it's going like this, right? And that's what we want to do. We want to keep growing and using what we learn. And that's what personal development does. It gives you tools. And that's what I've acquired over the period of my education over the last 32 years, is I've acquired tools from different places. And those tools have allowed me to handle what shows up in the moment, so that I'm not actually triggered like I used to be triggered, or that I'm not desolate or, hopeless, because you think, oh, hang on a second. I've been through challenges before. I've faced some challenges and I got through those. I can get through this, It's just a case of accessing the most powerful resources that we have available to us at all times. And that's emotions. And most people forget that. They think, the most powerful resources are money, time, connections, and that kind of thing. But really it's not. It's how you adopt yourself in the moment. It's the emotions you tap into in the moment. And we can all tap into powerful emotions, or we can also be tricked by the mind and then be controlled by disempowering emotions. It really is up to us at the end of the day. So
what you just said there about sort of the trajectory, and I think it's so prevalent what you said about the whole, if you zoom in, it can look like it's the end of the world, but you zoom out and it's part of growth. Everyone knows about growing pains. It's a normal thing, but we don't necessarily think about it in the context of our own personal development, professional development when it comes to that. One of the things that I really would love to delve into, because I know it's a big topic that you talk about at Awaken, which is your sort of signature program, which is it's a 2 or 3 day event now.
It's a 3-day weekend. And actually, at the beginning of this year, at the end of last year, I was talking to my team, and we were going to actually make it and add a 4th day, because there's so much stuff that we can do, and there's so many things that I like to expand on. And so it was going to be a 4-day weekend, but I've been doing a 2-day online weekend through the lockdown period, which has been awesome. And we just taken a few. There's just 4 areas that I've taken out of that 4-day week or that 3-day weekend, and those 4 areas I've expanded on over the 2-day period, and we go deep over the 2 days, and it's been really amazing. We've had people from 20 countries attending the online experience, which blew my mind. Actually, it's been amazing. But yeah, at Awaken, we talk about all of those aspects around the ego self, the false self, the divine self, the authentic self, the God self. Really, just to give you a little bit of context, I grew up in South Africa, as I said, and it was very religious. And I didn't realize that until I went back to South Africa in 2001. November 2001, I moved back to South Africa, and I was there for 7 years. And when I got back there in January 2002, I did my first corporate talk there for a big company there. It's a billion rand organization, a family business. And those people have become very good friends of mine, the whole family, and became my biggest client in South Africa. My first corporate talk there. But what I noticed was that it's very religious, right? South Africa. And then I looked around. Now, what I did was, when I came out in the military, the first thing what I also did after I read Think and Grow Rich is I began to study religion, because I went to 2 Catholic schools, and I was haunted, and demonized by the fact that I had killed people. And I went to 2 Catholic schools where I had religious dogma shoved in my brain. Before I even went to Catholic schools, before I even went to school at the age of 5, at the age of 4, I was going to Sunday school. So I had that kind of stuff in my head. When I started to study and read, and especially when I came across spiritual psychology in 1999, for the longest time, I thought, I'd love to form a workshop where covers this kind of material where it helps people to really connect with the biggest part of themselves, which is the spirit. You know, this we mind, body, and spirit, three aspects to life, right? Mind, body, and spirit. Or you can call it the Holy Trinity, as they call it in religious circles. But that's what it is, mind, body, and spirit. We spend most of our time trapped in the mind. We ignore the body, which is why we become sick. And we completely don't even enter into the spiritual realm at all. The vast majority of human beings never even consider that aspect of life. And therefore, they get to the end of their life either too early or unexpectedly. And what do they have? They have all these fears about what comes after death, man. And those fears, a lot of people carry those fears throughout their life, you know. And before they even get to that point, they have this, you know, this conversation. Oh my God, you know. But there's not, you know, I've you know what I've studied and learned. Death is nothing to fear. There is no. I don't believe in death. I believe in passing. I believe in transition. I believe in, you know, when you study the three aspects of being human, mind, body, and spirit, and you look at the largest part of being human is actually spirit, and we ignore that most of our lives. And when we've got all these, you know, this religious dogma that's been shoved into our heads, and religious dogma is global. You know, there's so many different religions, but it essentially is the same thing. And what people are most afraid of, without even realizing it, there's all this unconscious guilt that affects the whole of the human race, and most people are not even aware of that. Is the unconscious guilt that we are separate from our Creator, and we're not. You know, we are the Creator. We are divine at the highest part of ourselves. And so my workshop is all about that. It's helping people to understand the false self and how it separates them from their godly self, from their divine self, their authentic self. And not religious, because I'm not religious by any means. Although I've studied religion in a very in-depth fashion, but I am somebody who believes in oneness. I believe that we're all the same. I believe that everything is the same thing. When you study energy, you study physics. If you're a scientist, you'll understand that. And this whole religious dogma is what separates human beings, because everything symbolizes separation. When we look around, everything symbolizes division. And that's our biggest problem. We're divided everywhere. We are divided. Just have a look online. You see people divided everywhere. And that's the biggest problem we have. And in being divided from each other, we're actually dividing from ourselves. So we don't even realize that we are separate. We divided within ourselves. That's our biggest problem. And that's why we have so much pain and suffering in the world. And so my workshop helps people to understand that, helps people to understand that they are made up of three parts, mind, body, and spirit. And how can they connect with the deepest part of themselves and live from that place where they can understand the ego self is all about fear and separation and division. And the false self is all about accumulation and validation. Sorry, I just had a call coming in there, and that's from somebody international, but it doesn't matter. And so, yeah, it's about, you know, the false self and the ego self is about validation, accumulation, looking good, you know, keeping up with the Joneses. And that's, you know, and that's been something that's been programmed into us for years, decades, you know, since the invention of advertising, since the invention of the TV, since the 24-hour news channel, the very first time that, you know, Ted Turner said, hey, you know what? I've got an idea. Let's create a 24-hour news channel. Everyone said to him, what are you talking about? No one's going to watch the news 24 hours a day. He said, yeah, watch, you'll see. And those three things, my friend: advertising, TV, 24-hour news.
On the ego side of things, so it's really, really interesting what you just said there. And you're talking about that, being able to live from that place where sort of your inner self, your true self, if you like, your most pure self. So if people right now, and I know I certainly had this in the past, where my conditioning had led me to a point where there was like a bravado that I was putting on of wanting to come across in a particular way, and all these different things. Now I've had a really interesting experience this year. So like many other people, hair got a bit long. I shaved my head this year. Never. I'm 7 years old. I had a shaved head. So in 25 years, I hadn't had a shaved head. I'd always had hair. And it was a really interesting point for me, because the person that I used to see in the mirror was Will Polston, who had hair. Like, that's who I saw. And then having had my head shaved, it was like there's this different person in front of me. This identity that I'd created was no longer what I saw in the mirror. So
100%.
For people that have got their ego, because ego is quite often deemed to be sort of a negative thing, but my understanding is an ego is something that you create when you're younger to protect you ultimately. But then if people want to shed that skin, so to speak, and step into another version of themselves and lose an element of their identity, their ego, that they feel doesn't serve them anymore, but they're holding on to it, and they feel like they can't let go of it. How do they go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I love what you said about your hair, because if I can just add to that too. When I was 26 years of age, 27, 26, 27, 28, I had long hair, right? Long curly hair, long blonde curly hair. My hair was always blonde because I was always in the beach when I was a kid, and I was born with platinum blonde hair. Both my kids were born platinum blondes, and so I had this long curly hair, which was a major part of my identity, because I felt very ugly. I was teased about my nose my whole life. I was told I was ugly. I was told I had a flat nose. I was told ugly things about myself. And so when I looked in the mirror, I felt ugly. And I used to curse, I cursed life. I cursed God. I used to say, why was I born with this ugly nose? How come I don't look how come I don't look normal? This was my conversation with myself all the time. If somebody looked at me in public, I felt self-conscious. I used to think, oh my God, they're looking at they're looking at me. Please don't look at me, right? Because I felt so self-conscious. And I had this hair, and that was my identity, right? This long blonde hair, long curly hair. Chicks dig my hair, right? And I got a lot of power from that. I got a lot of validation from that. When I came back from America, I was living in America, and in 1996, lived in California, and I was there for about a year. And then I came back and I thought, you know what? I want to get myself a proper job, right? I want to get a sales job. Because I had a sales job in South Africa. I had a company car. I used to wear a suit. I used to go and see people, and I was selling a product. And I thought, you know what? I want to do that here in England. And, I can't do that with long hair. So what I did was I decided to cut my hair. The first time, since I was in the military, right? And I'd been growing my hair since the military. And that was kind of like a defiant thing without even realizing it. I realized afterwards, I thought, you know what, I'm going to show you, right? No one's ever going to cut my hair. And I grew my hair from the moment I came out of the military. I never cut my hair until that moment. And this is like, now you're talking it's about 8 years later. And my hair, because my hair is very curly, I used to be able to reach up and grab the ringlets of my hair and then pull it down to my backside, right? And if I let go, it would bounce at this, it was like almost like a fro, right? But it was these, and whenever I went out, man, I used to get a lot of attention from my hair from women, and that was my ego, that was my identity, because I felt ugly, and I felt, very self-conscious, and yet I got a lot of attention from my hair. When I shaved my hair off, I cried, man. I cried. I thought, oh my God, what have I done? I cried. It took me a long time to get used to it, because that was my identity. So I really relate to what you said, and I think a lot of people will relate to that, even if they don't realize that. It's the way we formed our identity, and what it is, it's the way we've learned to like ourselves, in spite of what we've been told not to like about ourselves. I'm going to say that again. It's very powerful. It's the way we do things. We dress in a certain way. And think about this is the same for piercings, tattoos, everything. People, I've had many conversations with people about tattoos. They say, no, I don't do tattoos for that reason. I say, well, really? When you did your first tattoo, were you 100% conscious? Did you actually sit down and think, why am I doing this? What is the reason for this? No. Most people get a tattoo in the beginning because, wow, you know what? Wow, that looks cool on another person. That might look cool on me. But they don't realize that there's something underneath that's driving them. That's going to make them more acceptable. It's going to make them more, it speaks to that one of those underlying premises that creates pain and that creates trauma in people, is I don't fit in. How can I fit in? And so whatever we do to ourselves to make ourselves more acceptable, to get more validation, because what we are trying to do is we're trying to undermine the internal narrative that says I'm not acceptable. I don't fit in. I'm not good looking. I'm not smart enough. I'm not rich enough. I'm not beautiful enough. I don't fit in there. I'm not in that trend. I'm not in that clique. And so all of that is lending to that. So identity is something we form very, very early on. Because as soon as a child starts to individuate away from its mother, around the age of 18 months or 2 years of age, a child starts recognizing for the first time, oh, I'm not my mother. A child always thinks that the mother and the child are one up until that point, because you feel you're not even conscious of it at the time. Although there is conversation, there's a lot of credibility that lends to the fact that we are conscious right from the time of our inception, because consciousness comes before DNA, and that's been proven now. However, you don't remember those moments. Your first 6 months of your life, the first 12 months of your life. However, when you take a child away from its mother for an extended period of time, at that time, it starts to feel that separation. And then what happens is how gets that connection back again as it cries. That's the only way it knows how to communicate. So, but then as soon as a child starts to think, oh, wow, I'm not my mother. I'm individual. The identity starts forming. Language comes in at that time too. That's when a child starts saying its first words. Now it's starting to use language. And then what happens is it's individuating. It's becoming an individual. The ego is about being individual, unique, separate, separate. And the ego then learns to what? We learn about, in our language, in using language and communication, internal, external, we're also learning about criticism now, because we are looking for validation. And so we'll do anything to get love. And so what we start absorbing from the world around us is the way people communicate. Initially our parents, and then our extended family. And if you just open your ears and you listen, and you sit in any environments and you listen to people speak to each other, you'll hear most of the time they're talking to each other in a very unloving way. That's just the way it is. People talk to each other online like this all the time now. People talk to each other like this in the streets. It's just very unloving. And in fact, right now, with what's happening in the world right now, we are being encouraged to stay away from each other. We're being encouraged to look at each other as threats. We're being encouraged, right, to look at each other as danger. That's been happening for the last 6 months. We've been told not to social distance. That is completely against our nature. Completely. We are wearing masks, so we can't even read each other's we can't even read the micro muscle, the significance of the face, which tells a story. We can't see that now. All we see is eyes, so we can't even pick up those unconscious signals that, that we connect unconsciously. We can't even pick all that. So it's all about separation now. And that feeds into, this idea that survival, got to survive. And that's what the ego is about. Ego is all about survival. How can I make sure that I'm safe? How can I make sure I'm validated? How can I make sure I'm important? Because from the very early, from the first moment when we feel separation, and remember, listen, now this opens up a brand new conversation, which we probably don't have time for right now. But if you then add to that unconscious guilt, people say, what is unconscious guilt? The unconscious guilt of mankind. And when I say mankind, I'm talking about from the very first moment, right? And the unconscious guilt. And what is that unconscious guilt? It feeds directly into the ego. And if you bring in spiritual psychology into this, the unconscious guilt is that very first moment when the ego tricked us into believing that we are separate from God. And what is God? I don't mean religious God. I mean creation. I mean divine creation. The consciousness that gives life, the consciousness that gives rise to everything. It's a very deep conversation, and there's so many different places you could go with this. But let's bring it back to just like the general application of day-to-day living for human beings. Our biggest fear is that we are unloved. Our biggest fear is that we're alone. Our biggest fear is that we're not accepted for who we are. So what we do is we use the ego and we use our individual identity to make sure that we are accepted, to make sure that we fit in, to make sure we're validated. We do that through all kinds of means, by putting things on our body, by putting things in our body, by accumulating things we don't need, all of those things. I used to believe that all of those things were important to me, so then that was my mission. But really now, I can recognize how there's a part of me that needed that stuff to feel validated. Now I don't need that stuff to feel validated, because I validate myself every single day. And then what I do is my mission is to validate other people and just to see them. That's what, and again, I said, we don't want to go down that conversation about what's happening in the world now and what's being fed to us. But that's what frustrates me, is that it's very difficult to validate people now, because people feel unseen even more than ever right now. It's feeding directly into their primal fear of being unseen, because we have to wear masks. That makes people anxious. We separated. That makes people anxious. People haven't seen their families for long periods of time. The elderly that are in care homes, their families can't visit them. That makes them extremely anxious. People are dying alone. All of this is feeding into our primal fear of being alone. And then we forget that we're actually not alone. We're never actually alone, but we've never been trained. We haven't been trained, and we haven't been nurtured into we haven't been trained and nurtured into that fundamental underlying belief, or that knowing that we are never alone. And so that feeds directly into the ego. Shit, I'm alone. I'm not validated. I'm not important. I'm not, what can I do to be important? And so one of the most powerful tools known to man since the beginning of time to be important is to be loud, is to raise your voice, to be aggressive, to be important, to violence. I mean, look at what happened just the other day. I think it was yesterday. Was it the day before yesterday? People will do all kinds of things to be infamous. Somebody just shot themselves on TikTok live. They blew their head off, or they blew themselves away with a shotgun. And that's gone, and people are sharing that virally. One of my friends sent me a message, said, whatever you do, tell your kids to stay off TikTok for a little time if they're using it, because there's this crazy viral video that's going around, and someone who just shot themselves with a shotgun on live on camera. Look at what that good guy did last year when he put that camera on his helmet. And he walked around with all these, these military, these automatic weapons. Did you see that on Facebook?
No.
Last year. And he shot these people. He went into all these mosques and he shot these people, feeding it live on Facebook. It was a live feed. People do crazy things now to feel validated, to feel important, to feel like, you know what? I'm seen. I'm going to make sure that I'm seen. I'm going to make sure I leave this earth. I might leave this earth alone. I might leave this earth hated, but you'll never forget me. So they do weird stuff.
So, and I'm really conscious of time, and there's two other questions I want to ask you before we wrap up. But if that is someone right now, if they go, do you know what? Yeah, look, I am that person I am doing, like you said, putting stuff on your body, in your body, whatever, to acquiring material things to get that validation. What's the solution?
Wow, this solution is, it's a simple but not easy solution. It's simple because as Einstein said, simplicity is just following sequence, right? When you follow sequence, you find a set sequence and it leads to a desired result. That's simplicity. And he said, in spite of the fact the universe is so complicated, when you break it down, it's actually there's simplicity in the way it unfolds. It's not easy because, again, the mind is a tricky subject. That mind is a tricky terrain. It's a tricky place. And the little voice in people's heads that's constantly there will always be saying things like, well, that sounds weird. That's weird. That's odd. That sounds crazy. I'm not a psycho. I don't want to go and visit a shrink. I don't want to go and do that. I don't want to go to a seminar. I don't want to do that weird stuff. I don't want to look in the mirror and tell myself I'm important, tell myself I love myself. But really, the simplistic answer is self-love. Self-love is healing your inner child. As I said earlier in this conversation, we are all traumatized children walking around in big bodies. And because we traumatized children walking around in big bodies, we've never really initiated into adulthood in a healthy fashion. This is very common right now around the Western world, is that if you look in the Western world, that's where most of our problems are, in the Western world. If you look in some of these cultures, like in Africa and India, in places like that, these tribal cultures, they initiate their boys into manhood through initiation process, which is a healthy thing to do, because then you're teaching a young boy to become a man. You're teaching them. Sorry, Will, he's still there. Yeah, there was a call. You're teaching young boys to transform their emotional maturity, is to handle their emotions. You're teaching young boys, you know what? It's okay to cry as a man. Crying is part of life. Challenges are part of life. Frustration is part of life. However, you can tap into another part of yourself that will allow you to do that. If you just allow yourself to be vulnerable, you can use your emotions powerfully. And so initiation process is non-existent in the Western world. And so, we don't teach young girls how to become women in a healthy fashion. We're starting to do that stuff for sure. There's a lot of that stuff happening in the world today, but it's not enough, man. It's just not enough. I actually watched a video yesterday. A friend of mine sent me of a beautiful man in America who teaches, and he focuses on young black boys. I think it's in Detroit. I think it is actually. But he has this karate dojo where he takes young boys and he teaches them how to process emotion in a powerful way using martial arts. And he teaches them how to break through their own fears, how to break through their own pains. And really what he's doing is he's teaching them how to be emotionally mature. And I love that. And I watched 2 videos yesterday of his, and I started following him on Instagram, and he's teaching young boys that it's okay to cry. It's okay to cry. And as a man, you will cry, and it's okay to cry as a man, because there's nothing wrong with that. Because what you do is when you cry, you process emotion. If you don't cry and you suppress emotion, that builds up over time, and that's unhealthy. That's where cancer comes from. That's where rage comes from. That's where aggression comes from. That's where violence comes from. It's unprocessed emotion. And if you look at men who have never really been taught how to process emotion, or have never been really loved, if you look at most men in jail, most of the men in jail have come from a family where they haven't seen their father since they were young. Their father disappeared. Either their father went to prison, or their father was killed, or their father was non-existent. And so what they do is they go looking for that validation, because men need young boys need validation from older men. And so they go looking for it. And what they'll do is they'll be attracted to it in the wrong directions, because what it's offering is a different kind of validation. And we see this all the time. That's why gangs are so prevalent. That's why gangs are so popular for young boys who don't have healthy male role models in their lives. So yeah, it's a challenging thing, man. We live in a very challenging time right now. It's only become more challenging. So individually, I said right at the beginning of lockdown, right at the beginning of this thing, I said, this is an opportunity for us to individually raise our own individual consciousness and collectively raise our consciousness. And what's that going to mean? That means we have to individually look at where we feel we're lacking and ask ourselves the questions, is what I perceive I'm lacking really lacking? Or is it just a figment of my imagination? How can I validate myself on a regular basis, on a daily basis, so I feel healthy? So I feel healthy emotionally, so I don't have to go looking for that in unhealthy ways, emotional ways that are not serving my spirit. Healthy self-inquiry on a daily basis. Why am I feeling? I'll give people a series of questions that helps them to discover what they're feeling, why they're feeling it, what's giving rise to that emotion, and what's the underlying unmet need. We all have these emotional needs that drive our emotions. When those needs are not met, those emotions will come out and they might erupt, because it's the fastest way to feel validated is eruption, emotional eruption, because then you get people's attention, you get connection. And it's also about emotional addiction. It's a conversation that, it can go on for ages in so many different directions. I'm all the time while I'm talking to you, I'm thinking about how can I keep it simple, because I want to go off in that direction. I think, no, I can't go down there because I can't finish that conversation. I can't go down there. I can't finish that conversation. We don't have time. But at the end of the day, to answer your question, is you have to learn to love yourself. You have to accept yourself for who you are, accept your flaws, accept the fact you've made mistakes, accept that where you are in your life right now is where you are, and you can deal with it. And there are ways to deal with it. And it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to feel what you're feeling. It's not the end of the world. You will get through what you're going through. But it makes it more difficult now. And I think it's more difficult than ever. And we was just having a conversation. I told you earlier, I'm at my friend's house, and he's got his three kids here, all, fully grown. And we're just talking about, you and I spoke about it before we started speaking here live, about this thing about, you can't get together in large groups than 6. People naturally, we connect. That's our natural thing. It's part of who we are. So it's connection, socializing, that's what makes it even more difficult for people. That's why, the challenges that have gone through the roof that we're not talking about yet. And obviously the repercussions of what's happening right now will be felt long into the future. Not only the financial repercussions, but, the lack of connection, the suicide rates that are going through the roof, the domestic abuse, the anxiety, the depression. It's a really tough time. What can we do about it individually? Become healthy. As healthy as you can. Focus on yourself. What can you do to validate yourself on a daily basis? What can you do to process your own unprocessed trauma? What can you do to heal the little boy in your heart, the little inner child, your little boy, your little girl? How can you love them even more? How can you have even more compassion for yourself? How can you just, how can you give yourself relief from the fact that, yes, maybe you haven't. Oh my gosh, so many people trying to ring me. How can you give yourself relief, from the fact that maybe you're not where you thought you should be right now in your life because somebody told you that you should be further ahead, or you should have gone in this direction, or perhaps you were told when you were younger, you should be doing this, or you should be doing that. But that's okay. You know what I mean? Make peace with where you are right now, and make peace with who you are, and just love yourself more and more every day. And then what you can do is now you can be more compassionate for other people. The more compassion you show for yourself, the more compassion you can have for other people. The more you can understand other people. When I walk around, I notice, this is a good thing I think for us to kind of start ending off on. When I walk around, in spite of all the work I've done, when I walk around, I hear my little ego voice in my head saying, looking at people wearing masks and saying, oh my God, why are you wearing a mask? Why have you allowed yourself to brainwash about the fact you should be wearing a mask? Because my conversation is it doesn't work. Now, as soon as that happens in my head, I say, hey, Allan, don't judge. People are doing the best they can with the resources they have and with the level of consciousness they have right in this moment. They obviously believe that it's important to wear one. They believe that they're doing the right thing. Who am I to judge them? So then what I do is I have compassion. So I move So I notice my own judgment, then I move into compassion as fast as I can. I've been practicing that for a long time, for many years. And I can do it very, very quickly. And then as soon as you move from that into compassion, you understand, oh, wow, you know what? We all just doing the best we can based on the level of consciousness we have. And so, you know, if I can be more loving with the people around me, with the strangers I see in the street, you know, my belief is that my energy is affecting the space I'm in. You know, my consciousness is affecting the space I'm in. You know, we talk, yeah, and you know, you can then, a good example of that is the aura. We all have an aura, right? You spoke about aura right at the beginning of this conversation. You can actually capture an image of your aura, right? You can use Kirlian photography to capture the image of a person's aura. Depending on the emotion they're in, the emotion you're in defines your aura. It defines the level of your aura, the intensity of your aura, the circumference of your aura, the space your aura. When you're in a loving, compassionate state, and you really are in a loving, compassionate state, your aura is 12 to 18 feet in all directions, 12 to 18 feet. That means you can affect somebody without even opening your mouth, just by what your intention is, just by the energy you're in. All you have to do is focus. You can just be focusing on love and compassion. In your mind, you can just send somebody, a stranger, you can say to a stranger, I love you. I feel for you. I can see that you're afraid right now. I can sense that you must be in fear right now. Here's some of my love. Now, they might not even be aware of it consciously, but my belief is that if more of us start walking around like that, we can affect people, you know, just by doing that. And everything is energy. So
Love it. Well, Allan, as always, you've got so much wisdom and life-changing information. One podcast is definitely not enough. So I'd love to have you as a guest again. And look, we'll go in further, and we can go into some of those rabbit holes that we didn't go into today. But it's already what's been shared has been super valuable. So I've got one question I always like to ask every guest.
Yes,
and we'll keep it, and we'll in sort of the shortest way that you can explain it. If you could go back and tell young Allan, the teenager, let's say, one message now, what would you want to share with him?
I would say, I've been asked that question before, and the answer is the same for me. I would just say to that little young kid, I would say, don't be afraid. Just love yourself and just understand. You know, I would encourage that little boy to not be afraid and love himself more, and not be so. I used to judge myself so very, very heavily, you know. I was condemn myself. Self-condemnation, you know, is something that caused a lot of pain for me. And I, you know, as a result, I mean, I went through a large period of my young life hating the person I saw in the mirror, like really just, you know, couldn't stand what I saw because I bought into what people said about me. And so I would say to that young boy is just, you know, love yourself more. Don't fear. Don't be so afraid.
Love that. Thank you so much. And for people that have been listening to this and been mesmerized, which I'm sure there's many, and people thinking, I've got to find this guy, where can people connect with you, find you, find out more about what you do, and Awaken online and everything else you're up to?
Well, there's I've got a website, allanspeaks.com, ALLAN speaks.com, and then they can connect me on Facebook. And I've got obviously a personal profile. I've got a page. I've also got an Instagram account. So all they need to do is type my name. And if they can get access to my name through you, then they can just Google my name.
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll put the Allan Speaks website in the show notes. So if you listen to this right now and you want to get to access, then jump to Allan Kleynhans, and they can go on the website and get access to you there, which is great and definitely worth connecting. Because you're Allan Speaks on Instagram, is that right as well?
On Instagram, it's just my name, Allan Kleynhans.
Oh, right, okay. Allan Kleynhans. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. Okay, so Allan, once again, thank you so much. Look forward to having you on the show again soon. Really great.
Thanks, my man.
Absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on the show, buddy. And listen, I just want to say one more time, but it's fantastic work that you've been doing. Sorry, interruption there, another phone call. It's fantastic work that you've been doing, my friend, over the last several years since we've become friends. You know, you've also been serving a lot of people right across the country, and it's great to see that. Just keep doing that stuff, my man. Thank you for having me on our show. I really appreciate being with you.
Pleasure. Thank you. And for you that are listening, until next time, make it happen.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Make It Happen with Will Polston podcast. Make sure you join Will's free Facebook group the Make It Happen community. Please support the show by subscribing on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or Google Play. Share this episode with at least one friend you think would benefit from it, and give Will a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts. Until next time, make it happen.